They first sensed it long before they saw it. The deep, rhythmic thrum rolling across the water, a sound unlike anything the Imperial Japanese Army had heard in China, Burma, or the Philippines. At dawn, the horizon shimmered with movement, and Japanese coastal defenders realized, with a tightening dread, that the Americans were coming not as scattered raiding parties, but as a coordinated, mechanized tidal wave. It was August 1942 on Guadalcanal, November 1943 on Tarawa, June 1944 on Saipan. The names changed, the islands changed, but the feeling among Japanese infantry remained the same: fear of the sea, fear of what would rise out of it. For the first time in their military history, they were facing an enemy whose method of attack defied prediction. The Japanese had trained to repel landings based on their experience against poorly equipped regional forces. Their doctrine assumed small boats, slow unloading, chaotic waves of infantry vulnerable to machine gun fire and pre-sighted artillery. But the Americans came with something else entirely: a structure, a system, a choreography of steel and fire. They came with the Higgins boat, the humble-looking craft that could drop its ramp and spill an entire platoon onto the sand in seconds. They came with LVTs, tracked landing vehicles that ignored reefs, ignored obstacles, ignored every natural barrier the Japanese believed would funnel the attackers into predictable kill zones. They came with battleships and cruisers thundering in the distance, their shells falling with terrifying precision as the defenders crouched in bunkers. On the morning of August 7, 1942, when U.S. Marines made their initial landings on Guadalcanal, Japanese defenders, mostly engineers and security detachments, watched in disbelief as lines of landing craft approached the beach with mechanical discipline. The sea was alive with movement. The landing waves came not in a single effort, but in timed increments, each with its own role: riflemen, machine gun teams, mortars, engineers. It was the first hint of a truth that would haunt Japan for the rest of the war. American amphibious assaults were not chaotic gambles. They were machinery, and machinery does not tire, does not break, and does not hesitate. But it was at Tarawa in November 1943 that this fear crystallized into something deeper, something approaching terror. The Japanese had fortified Baitio Island with bunkers, seawalls, and machine gun nests, believing that the coral reef would destroy any landing attempt by preventing American craft from reaching the shore. They prepared for a massacre, confident that the attackers would bog down in the surf. Then the LVTs appeared, amphibious tractors crawling over the reef, shrugging off obstacles, carrying Marines directly onto the sand in seconds. Positions that were supposed to be impregnable suddenly found themselves flanked. The defenders realized in minutes that every assumption they had about stopping an American landing was obsolete. Reports recovered after the battle revealed the shock among Japanese survivors. Quote, "Their vehicles come from the sea like monsters. We cannot predict where they will land. We cannot kill them before they reach us." Unquote. Higgins boats grounded, Marines poured out, and the assault expanded in directions the defenders had not prepared for. Where the Japanese had placed mines, Americans avoided them. Where the Japanese had aimed their guns, Americans landed somewhere else. The unpredictability was worse than the firepower itself. This pattern repeated at Saipan in June 1944, where the Japanese believed the Americans would land at one of two obvious beaches. Instead, 8,000 Marines came ashore in an overwhelming first wave, supported by naval bombardment so intense it destroyed communication lines before the Japanese even understood the main landing point. The surf was thick with landing craft, each wave timed with mathematical precision. The Japanese were stunned again, not by the number of attackers, but how structured the assault was. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no chance for local commanders to exploit a flaw. Every time the defenders thought the Americans were committed to one section of beach, a new wave shifted the battle elsewhere. Worse still was the presence of carrier aircraft circling above from the moment the first landing craft touched the water. The Japanese had never faced an enemy capable of combining naval bombardment, amphibious assault, and close air support into a single synchronized operation. The Americans did not simply land, they controlled the sea, the air, and the land simultaneously. Japanese defenders began to fear not only the initial landing, but the fact that they never knew where the next wave would hit. A platoon could brace for an attack from the east, only to find the next landing wave coming from the southwest. A bunker prepared to repel a frontal assault might suddenly find itself enveloped from the rear by LVTs, crawling over terrain assumed impassable. By the time Americans landed on Tinian in July 1944, the fear had matured into certainty. Tinian was defended by 9,000 Japanese troops who expected a landing at two massive beaches in the south. Instead, the Americans struck the island's tiny northern shore, two narrow beaches only 60 and 90 meters wide, because they knew their amphibious system could force the landing anywhere. The Japanese had dismissed those beaches as unusable. The Marines landed there in force, establishing a foothold so quickly that the island's fate was sealed in a few hours. It was not simply that the Americans were strong, it was that they were unpredictable. They could land at low tide or high tide, on coral, sand, rock, or volcanic ash. They could bring tanks ashore in the first minutes. They could drop attack aircraft overhead minutes before landing. They could divert waves mid-operation, adjust timing, and reinforce success instantly. Japanese defenders, even well-trained ones, found themselves psychologically battered long before the shooting began. They studied tide charts, reef structures, sand composition, and geography. The Americans ignored all of it. They created a science of amphibious warfare that no other nation in the world could match. Every island battle began with the same thought spreading quietly through the Japanese ranks. Where will they come from? How many waves? And when will the real landing begin? That uncertainty was a weapon in itself, and for Japanese infantry, it was the beginning of terror. Long before the first Higgins boat splashed into the Pacific, or the first LVT crawled over a coral reef, the United States Marine Corps had spent 2 decades forging a doctrine the world had never seen before, a blueprint for taking heavily defended beaches with a combination of timing, firepower, and mechanical precision. Japan, confident after victories in Malaya and the Philippines, assumed that amphibious warfare meant chaotic boatloads of infantry scrambling ashore under fire. What they encountered instead, beginning in 1942 and perfected by mid-1944, was a refined, industrial-scale system of invasion. It was not a horde, it was a machine. And once it began to move, no Japanese unit, no matter how well dug in, could stop it. The foundation of this machine was intelligence and reconnaissance, the quiet work that took place weeks or months before any landing. American submarines mapped reefs and channels. Navy PBY Catalinas photographed shorelines at dawn and dusk. Underwater demolition teams crept along beaches measuring obstacle lines. Coast watchers transmitted Japanese troop movements. And American codebreakers, especially after mid-1943, provided commanders with Japanese defensive dispositions so accurate that Marine landing plans often anticipated bunker locations to within meters. Thus, the first terrifying reality for Japanese defenders was that the Americans often knew more about the beach than the men who lived on it. Then came the deception phase, which confused Japanese commanders before the first artillery shell ever fell. On Saipan and Tinian, American feints were so convincing that Japanese officers shifted whole battalions to the wrong beaches. At Okinawa, U.S. naval forces pretended to prepare a landing on the southeast coast, while the real landing beaches on Hagushi were barely reinforced. Every time the Japanese thought they had identified the main landing point, The Americans revealed a second or third possibility, never allowing the defenders to mass forces at a single location. When the waiting was finally over, the next stage arrived: pre-landing bombardment. Japanese defenders had learned to fear naval guns early in the war, but by 1944, American bombardment was no longer general or random. It was systematic. Cruisers hammered bunkers at precise coordinates. Battleships fired at cave mouths identified weeks earlier. Destroyers walked shells along trench lines meter by meter. Spotting aircraft corrected fall of shot in real time. For the Japanese, even well-constructed bunkers shook like paper under 14-inch shells, and communication trenches collapsed from concussion. This bombardment did not always destroy positions outright, but it did something more psychologically damaging. It severed communications, blinded commanders, and left every defender unsure whether the next shell would land 10 meters away or directly on top of them. Then came the moment that defined American amphibious warfare, the landing waves, the heartbeat of the entire doctrine. Unlike earlier Allied landings, where troops arrived in scattered formations, U.S. Marines and soldiers landed in meticulously scheduled assault waves, each arriving with a specific tactical purpose. One wave carried rifle squads, the next carried machine gun sections. Behind them came 60mm and 81mm mortars, bazooka teams, engineers with demolition charges, and finally the armored punch, LVTs with 37mm or 75mm guns, and Sherman tanks offloaded from LCMs. Everything was timed to the minute. Japanese defenders could fire at one wave, but another appeared immediately, then another, and another. There was no pause to regroup, no break between attacks. The machine never stopped. The vehicles themselves added a layer of unpredictability Japan hated. The Higgins boat, small and fast, could scatter across the shoreline, landing platoons in unexpected places. But the vehicle that broke Japanese doctrine entirely was the LVT. Japanese defensive plans always assumed that coral reefs, pits, and sandbars would force landing craft to stop hundreds of meters from shore. But LVTs crawled over these barriers as if they didn't exist. They dumped Marines directly into the Japanese rear, bypassing carefully planned kill zones. At Tarawa, when the first LVTs clattered up onto the sand, a place officers had declared impossible, Japanese troops realized their entire defensive layout had been outmaneuvered before the main assault even began. Once ashore, American forces did something Japan was not prepared for. They brought the entire logistical base of the invasion with them, almost instantly. Ammunition dumps, radios, medical stations, and anti-tank guns arrived within hours. Engineers cleared obstacles and opened new lanes. The second and third echelons of combat troops landed the same day. Unlike Japan's opponents in earlier wars, Britain isolated in Malaya, China lacking sea control, America could reinforce success in real time. A breakthrough in one section of beach did not stall for lack of support. It grew stronger by the minute. And overhead, the final element of the doctrine circled: carrier air power. Japan had never faced an amphibious landing backed by fighter bombers ready to strike within minutes of a radio request. When Japanese strongpoints survived naval shelling, Marine pilots flying F-6Fs, SBDs, and later F-4Us pounded them with rockets and bombs. The Japanese defenders quickly discovered that even if they repelled the first wave, and even if they destroyed some landing craft, the Americans could erase their positions from the map with a single radio call. By late 1944, this doctrine had evolved into something Japan had no answer for: a synchronized, three-dimensional assault from sea, land, and air. It was not just overwhelming force, it was force applied with precision, intelligence, and speed. The Japanese infantrymen, crouching in a bunker or cave, never knew if the next threat would come from the surf, the sky, or the rear. They never knew if the landing in front of them was the real one or just a diversion. They never knew if the Americans would come at high tide, low tide, or across terrain previously deemed impassable. And above all, they never knew when the waves would stop, because they never did. For Japanese troops on the receiving end, the U.S. amphibious landing doctrine was not simply a method of attack, it was a nightmare engine, predictable only in its inevitability and terrifying in its precision. On paper, Japan's island fortresses were supposed to be unbreakable. Tarawa's BDO Island was ringed with blockhouses, trenches, machine gun pits, and 13 coastal artillery pieces. Saipan bristled with bunkers, anti-boat barriers, and mutually supporting strongpoints. Tinian had cliffs, narrow beaches, and latticeworks of mines that Japanese engineers believed made an invasion nearly impossible. Before 1943, Japan had every reason to believe fixed defenses, properly armed and manned by determined troops, could stop any landing cold. What they had not prepared for was an enemy capable of redefining amphibious warfare every time it touched shore. Between Tarawa, Saipan, and Tinian, the myth of the unassailable island defense collapsed with shocking speed, leaving Japanese troops stunned by how quickly their carefully built fortifications became irrelevant under American assault doctrine. Tarawa was the first seismic shock. The Japanese believed the coral reef surrounding BDO would trap American landing craft far offshore, turning the lagoon into a killing field. They emplaced machine guns, mortars, and coastal artillery to shred Marines struggling through deep water. It should have worked if the Americans had brought only Higgins boats. Instead, the first wave of Marines stormed ashore in LVT-1 and LVT-2 amphibious tractors that crawled right over the reef as if it were a mere bump in the road. Japanese officers watching through periscopes were stunned. The barriers they had trusted to funnel the enemy into kill zones had just been bypassed entirely. The LVTs climbed directly onto the beach, out of reach of many pre-sighted guns. Their machine guns swept trenches the Japanese believed would remain untouched until the second or third assault wave. And then came the Higgins boats anyway, dozens of them, carrying reinforcement after reinforcement despite withering fire. Even when Marines suffered catastrophic losses wading ashore, the system did not falter. New waves kept coming. Engineers blew gaps in seawalls. Tanks rumbled forward from LCMs. The Marines established footholds the defenders swore were impossible. BDO was declared secure in 76 hours. An island Japan believed could hold out for a month fell in barely 3 days. The message was unmistakable. Japanese defenses built on assumptions could not stop an enemy who refused to fight by those assumptions. Saipan was worse. Here, the defenders had cliffs, ridges, and a far larger garrison, more than 30,000 troops. They expected the Americans to land only where the beaches were wide and accessible. But on the morning of June 15, 1944, the U.S. Navy unleashed the heaviest pre-landing bombardment Japan had ever witnessed. Shells from battleships pulverized the coastline. Carrier aircraft bombed artillery pits. Communication wires snapped. Entire platoons were buried alive before the first Marines stepped onto landing craft. Japanese defenders stumbled out of bunkers dazed, half-deaf, unsure which positions had survived. Then the landing waves came. 4 Marine divisions in meticulously timed formations. When the first wave hit the shore, the Japanese fired fiercely. But unlike earlier enemies they had fought, the Americans did not stall. Riflemen pushed forward relentlessly. LVT A4 vehicles with 75mm howitzers blasted bunkers at point-blank range, a capability the Japanese never accounted for. The defenders had expected a pause between waves, a chance to reposition machine guns, resight mortars, plug gaps. There was no pause.
Waves arrived in intervals so short that defenders could not catch their breath, let alone mount counterattacks. By midday, the Japanese realized that the entire concept of fixed coastal defense was collapsing. They had designed their fortifications to repel landings at predictable beaches. The Americans bypassed some, landed heavily at others, and adapted instantly when currents or reefs caused confusion. Marine officers later described the landing as controlled chaos, but from the Japanese perspective, it was a hurricane, swift, overwhelming, unbroken. If Saipan showed the unstoppable momentum of the U.S. landing system, Tinian demonstrated its precision. Tinian's geography seemed to favor the Japanese completely. The southern beaches were wide and inviting, the northern ones narrow and hemmed in by cliffs. The Japanese fortified the southern beaches heavily, convinced no landing craft could approach the tiny northern coves called White Beach 1 and White Beach 2. The Americans disagreed. Before dawn on July 24, 1944, Marines and Seabees modified LVTs and landing craft to maneuver through the narrow coves. Naval gunfire pounded the few Japanese positions guarding the north. At 0740, the first assault wave touched down on beaches so small they barely fit a platoon. The defenders expected the Americans to be crushed instantly. Instead, the Marines established a beachhead in minutes, bringing artillery ashore faster than Japan believed physically possible. By midday, the Japanese realized with horror that the entire concept of fixed coastal defense had collapsed. They had designed their fortifications to repel landings at predictable beaches. The Americans bypassed some, landed heavily at others, and adapted instantly when currents or reefs caused confusion. Marine officers later described the landing as controlled chaos, but from the Japanese perspective, it was a hurricane, swift, overwhelming, unbroken. These three battles shattered Japan's confidence in fixed defenses forever. After Tinian, Japanese commanders openly acknowledged in reports sent to Tokyo that American amphibious capability rendered beach fortifications insufficient as a primary defensive measure. Japan began pulling forces inland for battles of attrition, but even then, the psychological damage was done. The defenders no longer believed they could stop the Americans at the waterline. The islands Japan believed to be ironclad had been breached not only by brute force alone, but by a sophisticated, flexible landing doctrine that rewrote the rules of coastal warfare. For Japanese troops, the lesson was grim. No beach was safe, no reef was a barrier, and no defense could be trusted once the Americans began to land.
To understand why Japanese defenders grew genuinely afraid of American landings, one must understand the machines that carried the assault across the water, machines that Japan neither possessed nor fully comprehended until it was far too late. These were not simple boats. They were extensions of American industry, engineering, and doctrine. The LVT, the Amtrak that crawled from sea to sand as if amphibious terrain meant nothing, and the Higgins boat, the wooden craft that delivered platoons with a speed and flexibility no other navy in the world could match. To Japanese infantry waiting in bunkers or behind seawalls, these vehicles came to represent something existential. The Americans could land anywhere, at any time, and in numbers that no coastal defense could contain. In earlier wars, defenders knew how to repel landings. They studied tides, built minefields, aligned machine guns on predictable beach points. But the arrival of the Higgins boat destroyed that certainty. Its shallow draft allowed it to skim over waters too treacherous for traditional craft, and its bow ramp, simple but revolutionary, meant American troops could disembark instantly instead of climbing over gunnels. To Japanese defenders, who expected minutes of vulnerability as attackers fumbled ashore, this was terrifying. A Higgins boat beached, the ramp crashed down, and a full platoon poured out in seconds. The machine turned what was once the most vulnerable phase of an amphibious assault into an attack carried out at full speed. But the real psychological earthquake came from the LVT. Japanese doctrine had always assumed that reefs, Sandbars and underwater obstacles would delay or break up enemy landings. At Tarawa, at Saipan, at Peleliu, the Imperial Army designed its entire defensive plan around forcing American troops to wade through shallow water while machine guns cut them down. LVTs obliterated that assumption. When the first LVT crawled over Bidio's reef in November 1943, Japanese soldiers firing from bunkers were momentarily stunned, not because the vehicle was invulnerable, but because it existed at all. Here was a tracked amphibious tractor that ignored terrain entirely. Machine gun fire sparked off its armored plates. It surged across the reef as though climbing a ramp, then plowed through the surf and onto the beach, delivering Marines to the very doorstep of Japanese strongpoints. For defenders who had spent months preparing overlapping arcs of fire along a fixed shoreline, seeing Americans breach those lines from unexpected angles was devastating. LVTs kept coming, LVT-1s and LVT-2s loaded with infantry, LVT-A-1s and LVT-A-4s armed with 37mm and 75mm guns that provided direct fire support the moment they touched sand. Japan had never imagined that armored firepower could arrive in the very first wave. Suddenly, a bunker designed to fire on waterborne attackers found itself under assault from land-based howitzers less than 2 minutes after the first Marines appeared. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The battle was already inside the perimeter before the defenders could adjust. What terrified Japanese defenders most was not the technical capability of these vehicles, but the tactical flexibility they granted the Americans. Higgins boats could swing wide, land at alternate beaches, or shift their approach mid-run if smoke or enemy fire made the original route dangerous. This ability allowed American commanders to react instantly to conditions the Japanese believed would stall an attack. If one lane collapsed, another lane opened. If reefs blocked one approach, LVTs found a new one. On Saipan, when stronger-than-expected currents pushed landing craft off course, the Americans simply redirected subsequent waves, using LVTs to mark safe channels. Japanese observers were confused, then horrified as the landing continued without losing momentum. On Tinian, a beach only 60 meters wide became a highway for assault waves because Higgins boats and LVTs rotated with machine-like timing, unloading troops, pulling back, returning with reinforcements, all while Japanese guns struggled to track their movements. The defenders learned quickly that each LVT was not simply a vehicle, it was a wedge. Once an Amtrak broke through a choke point, dozens followed. LVTs formed chains, bringing ammunition, flamethrowers, radios, and engineers ashore faster than the Japanese could react. Unlike earlier enemies who staggered in small numbers, the Americans built beachheads like industrial assembly lines. Compounding the terror was the resilience of these vehicles under fire. Higgins boats were vulnerable but numerous. Destroying one meant nothing when 30 more filled its place. LVTs, though not heavily armored, were tough enough to survive the first bursts of fire, and even when hit, they kept moving. Japanese gunners frequently reported that their shots did not stop the enemy's vehicles unless they were struck perfectly. Perfection is a luxury defenders rarely have in the chaos of battle. Worst of all for the Japanese was the realization that these vehicles multiplied American firepower before the infantry even left the surf. LVT-A4s blasted trenches and pillboxes. Higgins boat-mounted 30 cal swept open sand. Sherman tanks rolled off landing craft minutes after the first wave. The Japanese had expected hours before armor reached shore. They got minutes. By 1944, it became clear to Japanese commanders that the Americans had solved amphibious warfare in a way no other nation ever had. Instead of adapting to the terrain, they brought machines that negated the terrain itself. Instead of being constrained by beaches, they carried the beach with them. Instead of allowing defenders to shape the battlefield, they reshaped it through relentless waves of mechanized assault. In bunkers and trenches across the Central Pacific, Japanese soldiers began to describe the American landings with a single recurring metaphor. They come from the sea like a tide that does not break. For Japan, the machines of American amphibious warfare did more than carry troops.
They carried inevitability.
By the spring of 1945, Japanese commanders no longer believed coastal fortifications could stop an American landing. Tarawa had been overwhelmed in days, Saipan in weeks, Tinian with surgical precision. But Okinawa was different. It was the gateway to the home islands, defended by more than 100,000 troops under General Mitsuru Ushijima. The beaches stretched wide and shallow. The coastal terrain offered abundant machine gun sites and artillery angles. If Japan could halt a landing anywhere, it would be here, on the largest island of the Ryukyus. Yet when dawn broke on April 1, 1945, and the horizon filled with the largest amphibious force in human history, the Japanese understood something far more terrifying than the possibility of defeat. They realized they had no idea where the Americans were actually coming ashore. For days, U.S. warships shelled the southern beaches while fake radio traffic and diversionary movements convinced Japanese commanders that the main landing would target the heavily fortified Minatoga sector. The Japanese shifted artillery, maneuvered reserves, and prepared for the expected bloodbath at the southern beaches. But the Americans never intended to land there. The entire bombardment was a feint. Meanwhile, the real invasion force, over 1,300 ships carrying 4 divisions, moved toward the western beaches at Hagushi, where Japanese defenses were comparatively light. When the sun rose on April 1st, a sight the Japanese soldiers later described as an ocean of steel filled the horizon. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, transports, LSTs, LCTs, LCMs, LVTs, and hundreds of Higgins boats churned toward the shore in a synchronized ballet of military power. And yet the beaches remained eerily silent. Japanese troops were not firing. No artillery exploded among the landing craft. The first wave hit the sand and encountered nothing. The Marines waited tensely, certain the silence masked a trap. But there was no trap, only absence. Japan had been outmaneuvered again. The Japanese high command, misled by American deception and unable to predict where the amphibious force would strike, had concentrated their best troops and heaviest guns miles away from the real landing point. On the greatest battlefield of the Pacific, Japan had guessed wrong. In the hours that followed, American forces did something Japan had never believed possible. They unloaded an entire army, 50,000 men along with their tanks, artillery, bulldozers, supply units, and command posts onto Okinawa shores without serious opposition. By nightfall, the U.S. controlled a beachhead nearly 10 miles wide and several miles deep. Japanese coastal defense strategy, perfected over years of bitter island combat, had collapsed before it even began. This, more than anything, terrified the defenders. The Americans had not just landed, they had materialized. To make matters worse, every Japanese counterattack attempt was shattered before it formed. Naval gunfire and carrier aircraft dominated the skies and seas. A battalion attempting to move south was struck by F-4U Corsairs within minutes. An artillery battery attempting to fire on the beachhead was destroyed by destroyers using radar-directed counter-battery fire. Nothing Japan committed could slow the American buildup. It was not simply overwhelming force, it was overwhelming speed. Most armies required days to unload thousands of tons of supplies. The Americans, thanks to LVTs, LSTs, cargo ships with mechanized cranes, and a vast logistics corps, did it in mere hours. Japanese intelligence reports written that night described the landing with a tone that bordered on disbelief. Their troops appear from the sea in endless numbers. Their ships fill the horizon. Their machines cross reefs and obstacles as if they are not there. We cannot determine where the next thrust will occur. The next thrust, in fact, occurred everywhere. While the main force pushed inland, engineers built roads, tank dozers carved supply lanes, and Seabees erected airstrips almost overnight. Within a week, Okinawa hosted American aircraft that pressed deeper into Japanese defenses and interdicted counterattacks. By mid-April, Japanese commanders recognized that all hope of stopping the invasion at the waterline, or even containing the beachhead, was gone. The Americans had bypassed their strongest coastal fortifications, just as they had at Tinian. They had rendered artillery placements useless, just as they had at Saipan. And they had landed armor and supplies before Japan could mount a coherent response, just as at Tarawa. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating. Japanese coastal defense doctrine had not merely failed, it had become irrelevant. In interrogation reports after the war, Japanese officers admitted that once the Americans mastered amphibious warfare, the beaches of the Pacific were no longer battlefields, they were doorways, and the Americans always had the keys. Okinawa was the final and clearest proof Japan could not stop a nation that could land anywhere, at any time, with an army ready to fight the moment it stepped onto the sand. For Japanese soldiers facing the tide of American amphibious power, the fear that had begun at Guadalcanal reached its peak at Okinawa. Not fear of death, but fear of inevitability. The Americans were not just coming, they were already there.